Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First, I just want to say thank you so much to Don and Serge and everyone for organizing this fantastic event. I feel like I'm really lucky lately. I've been going to things that are just really dynamic, and I'm learning a lot. When you work, I work in ePortfolios and have done so for about the last 14 years, so sometimes you get to a stage where you go to a conference and it's not that bad stuff is happening, it's just you've kind of heard it before, and this is really re-energizing, I think, to come here and have these conversations with all of you. So they asked me to talk a little bit about personal pathways and portfolios for learning, because that's the work that I've been doing for quite some time. I am a professor and I'm a historian at that, so when Bernard was talking about Luddites yesterday, I was sort of giggling to myself. But I have been using portfolios in my own classroom for quite some time, and in my previous life I was the executive director for the Center for Student Engagement and Learning Innovation at TRU, and so you'll see some of the bits of that in this presentation. And as Serge mentioned, also chair of the board of directors of ABLE, which is the Association for Authentic, Experiential, and Evidence-Based Learning in the United States. It's a nonprofit organization, really sort of, I would say, the professional organization for ePortfolios in North America, but also have partners in Europe and Australia. So really engaged in a lot of this kind of thinking. And of course, badges have been an important part of that. And you'll get some glimpses, I think, into how I'm thinking about the way badges might be useful with ePortfolios in this talk. But I really wanted to focus on this idea of developing future-ready skills and how we might situate that in terms of learning in the 21st century. I will be really upfront with you and say, for me, none of this stuff matters if it isn't rooted in the learner's experience of how they're learning across their learning career. And I know we've talked a lot about employability over the last couple of days, which I think, of course, is really important as students are spending a lot of money to come through higher education. But as a historian, and I guess somebody who works in the liberal arts, I really cringe a little bit about notions of learning for a career and having students come to study with us for a particular career. Over the last 20 years of my teaching, almost none of my students have gone on a pathway that went from, I'm going to come to university for a career and that's where I'm actually going to end up. Their pathways are much more circuitous, and I think that the whole idea of learning across the learning careers may be a better way of thinking about the work that we do in higher education. I'll then just share a little bit about our thinking around personal pathways and portfolios, particularly in terms of how portfolios can be used for learning development and how they can really illuminate pathways for learning. And then just finish with a short conversation about a project that I'm leading with my collaborator Tom Carey in Canada called the Ripple Project. So it's research and innovation on personal pathways and portfolios for learning. Tom is the acronym king, so he's come up with that lovely acronym, which we can talk about having a ripple effect and all kinds of fun stuff. But really how we're trying to engage partners across sectors to have conversations about how we might improve learning and the learning career. So we think about future readiness. This is something from EduGains, which is actually a K-12 organization in Canada, but really sort of this idea of what do students think the learning experience is about, and what are their ideas about learning, working, and living in the future. And you get that, I think, really important bit in the center that students should be partners in learning, and that's, of course, you're probably familiar with the students as partners, research and work that's happening. And certainly when I think of LR&G and some of the other projects that you've all described, clearly students are partners in the developmental work and the things that are happening. But they're also thinking about lots of different things, including what's their place in a globalized world and in this new world of learning and work that they'll have to engage in. And so I like this image a lot because it sort of gives us an overall snapshot of the kinds of things that learners themselves are thinking about as they move through their learner career. We also have really interesting, obviously, work and research on essential learning skills, and we've talked a lot about that over the last couple of days. These two slides are from the World Economic Forum, And you can kind of see that the 21st century skills are positioned in a very particular way, where we might have foundational literacies and things that are perhaps rooted in the disciplines, but then we may have competencies that are more what we might refer to as the soft skills. Oh, I love Patsy Colley's reframing of those as professional skills, because I think that is, they're not really soft, they're actually hard skills to develop, and so I like that framing. And then the kinds of behavioral or character qualities that we might want to see in our learners as they move through our systems. I think we also have a whole other set of digital literacy skills that we need to address, and one of the things that I think often gets missed in our conversations are these abilities to develop digital identities and the kinds of skills and abilities that we need to integrate into the work that we're doing with portfolios to ensure that our learners are developing those abilities. I don't know about any of you, but certainly my students do not have these capabilities coming into universities, and we tend not to really integrate the development of those abilities. I can speak as a historian. I can tell you none of my colleagues have learning outcomes on their outlines that address digital literacy, and I think that that's a real problem. We need to really make sure we're doing this actively with them. So if we think about designing for future readiness and the kind of learning that we want to happen, it really is integrative in nature. And this goes back to early work from the Carnegie Foundation, where Mary Taylor Huber and Pat Hutchings really advocated that we needed to take an integrative approach to learning experiences for students in higher education. And this quote comes from Carol Geary Schneider, who's just the most recent past president of the Association of American Colleges and Universities, where she really framed the value of her liberal education around the idea of developing big, broad, big picture learning, cutting edge scholarly inquiry, having our learners really engage with hard questions and engage deeply, and then have learning experiences that are really evidence-based. And so I think we want to be designing learning experiences that enable that, and I think the portfolio is particularly well suited to developing these kinds of abilities in our learners. The other thing that we need to remember, and again I keep thinking of Leila's presentation from yesterday around the playlists and where students' interests are. Sarah Stein Greenberg from Stanford University, she's the head of their design school, talks about the idea of really getting at what are our students' missions. And I think that that's such an important question to ask. We ought not to be saying, come in and get into this box of studying history or physics or engineering or whatever it might be. What's your mission? Where are your interests, I think, is where you're going with your work at LR&G with high school students. And how can we elicit that from students and give them opportunities to really speak to those issues in their degree programs? And I think that requires a very different kind of learning design than certainly the way history courses and programs were designed when I was a student, and might still be designed that way. So I think it does call for a rethinking of what we do. Personal pathways and portfolios for learning, I think, can really help us along in those design decisions, and we've got we know from lots of years of working with portfolios and certainly from the research that there are some elements that are really essential for successful ePortfolio implementations. Portfolios really are useful for documenting learning, which include knowledge, skills, abilities in different contexts and across contexts. So when I ask my learners to tell me about what they learned about thinking historically in a particular class of mine, I'm not just wanting to know what did that mean in the context of our classroom, and this is a challenge for students because they think what happens in the classroom must stay in the classroom, and I'm here to learn pre-Confederation Canadian history, and I must not think about any other learning experience that I'm having. And the portfolio actually just really jailbreaks that whole idea, because I say, no, I want to know what learning to think historically means to you as an individual, based on the learning in our classroom, but also the learning experiences you've had in other contexts, which might be other classrooms, but might very well be their workplace experiences, their learning in community, could be what they're doing in their residence. And most of my students are not history majors. So that's really important, to allow them space to really think about the connections that they're able to make between learning in and among contexts. Obviously, portfolios are very process-oriented. I would argue that if they don't include some sort of reflective thinking, then they're not really portfolios. They're a showcase, and it's great. You might be able to present evidence, but if the learner themselves hasn't really thought through what does this mean for me, and there isn't that meaning-making element, then it's not as useful. It should highlight the learner's pathway, and this is developmental. I mean, Dan and I were asked this question of Dan earlier about badges. I really, based on my observations of many, many students over many years, we know this is a developmental ability. My first-year students do not come in a place, or at least most of them don't, where they can really clearly articulate their pathway, and they may have a sense of where they want to go, but they haven't really been asked to think that way. One of my students that I'm teaching right now, I asked them to engage in an exercise where they wrote different versions of their life story. And she realized in writing her 2 versions that both her versions had a lot to do with theater and performing arts. She's a history major, but she's really interested in those topics. And she said to me, I realized that all of my research projects have had something to do with that, all history projects, but all to do with theater and the performing arts. And that was a revelation to her, and she's at the end of her degree program. So I think we need to open up space for learners, and that's why, again, I think the LR&G stuff is so exciting, to get them sort of articulating, what am I interested in? What might I do? And they're also really important because they provide authentic evidence of student learning, and I think we, again, if they're not designed to elicit that, then we have a bit of an issue. They should be empowering. We should be giving students opportunity to sort of identify who they are as learners and to be excited and empowered by that. They obviously should engage them, and I think they are very democratizing because we're not asking every learner to perform in one particular way, but rather opening up space for the learner themselves to tell us what is useful and valuable to them in those various learning experiences, and I'm sure we could come up with lots of other E's for ePortfolio. So just to give you a quick couple of examples of portfolios from students at my university, this is a student who was asked to sort of develop a portfolio as a proof of concept and think about how the learning that she engaged in at the university did make some sense when she brought it all together. And it was really interesting because she said, I'm really interested in photography. Can I bring that into, my ePortfolio? Can I reflect on the work that I've done living in residence as a residence ambassador? Can I bring, and we said, absolutely, Haley, bring it all together in whatever way makes sense to you. And her reflection about showing her portfolio to other people was that she was shocked that people were seeing her as the expert on Haley. And she said, the fact that readers are treating me like the expert, I know stuff, was really exciting to her. And I think that sort of speaks to some of the power that portfolios offer. Similarly, Simone used the portfolio to document co-curricular learning, so she engaged in a study abroad program where she was receiving a credential for global competency. And she talked about the ways that she could bring together that study abroad experience with the learning that happened in the classroom, and so that was quite exciting. And then Emily designed this portfolio we asked students to document for us how they were learning across our institutional goals or institutional priorities. And so Emily created this portfolio in order to do that, where she brings together her work in philosophy and her desire to work in the community, in the arts community. She was a double major, visual arts and philosophy. And this was an avenue for her to begin to bring together those shared interests and how she might live that out with her work in the community, and how she was already starting to do that. And I can tell you that she's a graduate and now works at the Kamloops Arts Gallery. So, so she was able to bring it all together and represent herself in a very particular way. And so we have often thought about ways in our work with ePortfolio implementation where we can embed through the curriculum opportunities for learners to reflect on and integrate the learning experiences at different moments of the learning career. This is an image that comes from Stanford, and my friend and colleague Helen Chen, who I do a lot of work with, where they were really thinking about where are the spaces that might give us opportunities to integrate the portfolio work in. And I will say that if portfolios aren't really tightly integrated into the curriculum, they really aren't that successful. So having a first year opportunity to start documenting and thinking about your learning is fantastic, but we know that unless there are opportunities for students to engage in portfolio thinking beyond one context, it tends not to stick. And so really thinking about how do we integrate through the curriculum and the co-curriculum opportunities for students to integrate their learning experiences is really important. But that also means that we need to be able to represent that learning in new and different ways. And so again, Helen, with some other colleagues, Lisa Brocott and Ashley Kehoe, have been thinking about how we might use the transcript in different ways. So we know static transcripts aren't so useful anymore. Employers don't really care, but if they can see a richer representation of student learning that goes beyond just that transcript, that's really exciting. And so how can we evidence that learning that does reside in both the formal and informal contexts at universities? Because of course our learners aren't just taking classes, they're doing lots of other things, and I think portfolios open up space to see that, but also these new comprehensive records are important too. And there's a large project happening in the United States between the Association of Registrars in the US and the Association of Student Affairs Professionals to really think about how would these comprehensive learning records, what would they look like, and how might we actually make this learning much more visible. So lots of universities are using portfolios and really doing that work of integrating portfolios across the curriculum. This is an example from the University at Buffalo in New York State, where they have in their general education program really thought through how they could integrate the portfolio thinking into the curriculum. And so Kathy Yancey, another expert on portfolios, talks about this as the ePortfolio as the curriculum. So it's not an add-on. They've used the ePortfolio as a way of designing the curriculum itself. And so students have opportunities. They start in a particular place. They all come in to an initial course on general education. They have some foundations that they have to go through, but then they have this pathway layer in the green where they're able to choose courses based on their interests and to develop their portfolios that way, and then they all come back together for a capstone learning experience. So I think a really nice example of pathways in the curriculum. Somewhat similarly at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indiana, or IUPUI, they've developed a similar model, and again using this mainly in general education, but also in some other disciplinary contexts, where their portfolio development is really focused on learning and identity development of the student themselves, and how the various learning experiences that they have on their campus really come together to allow them to develop their identities as learners over the course of their careers at the university, which I really like. So it brings in that more behavioral, effective, developmental kinds of context into the work and learning that they're doing. This is really messy, I know you can't read it, but just to give you an example, we on our campus decided to sort of design a proof of concept. So my team in the center really worked to think about, and this goes to Bernard's point yesterday about missional innovation. We all have missions on our university. If you go to any university website, you can find the university mission statement. You can probably find a set of graduate attributes or institutional learning outcomes that the institution is trying to achieve. But rarely do we tie the curriculum to those missions and institutional learning outcomes. We do budget a little bit, I would say, more often than not, but it's not necessarily explicit. And we were really interested in thinking about our particular strategic priorities for our institution, which are student success, intercultural understanding, undergraduate research capacity, entrepreneurial capacity, and sustainability, and thinking about what evidence would we need to see from learners that demonstrate that they're actually meeting those strategic priorities, so that we could assure ourselves that our graduates were actually living out the mission of our institution. Our students told us, and we did this in partnership with students, that they thought that we ought to have a developmental trajectory, but it shouldn't be first year, second year, third year, fourth year. We're an open access institution, so we have students coming from lots of different backgrounds, not all straight out of high school. And so they felt there ought to be a discover phase where you're able to just discover things, discover research capacity. There should be a connect phase where students are starting to make those connections. There should be a really clear experiential or experience phase, and then a become, which I would say would be the proficiency stage. And we designed this so that we have very clear learning outcomes for each of the boxes in the matrix and rubrics that go along with them. But the idea of the concept was that this was placed in the hands of the students. So, Norm comes to TRU and starts his degree program, but he says, you know what, I've owned my own business. So I don't think I'm really at discover entrepreneurial capacity. I think I'm at become. So you can put in evidence of learning in that other context and for sure get, credited for that stage. So every student gets to decide what their own pathway looks like. There may be some students who don't really want to develop entrepreneurial capacity, or at least explicitly don't think they do, but may have opportunities to do that work in some of their classes. So we really wanted to put this back into the hands of students and allow them to chart their own pathway through our degree programs, which again I think is somewhat similar to the work that you're doing at LRNG. Obviously, our vision was that all of this could be badged. Again, it was a proof of concept, so we've really just done this beginning stage, and we had some of our students start to, like Emily, map their portfolio work to this particular template. But hopefully gives you an idea of the kinds of things we could do with portfolios and badges if it was fleshed out more fully. So if we really want to think about how we might design for the future, I think we really have to consider that the work we do at universities is fantastic, but we are often operating in silos. And so it seemed to Tom and I in our thinking about where we wanted to go with our research that we really needed to do a better job of engaging other stakeholders in the conversation. And certainly in the portfolio work that I've done, we've always taken a stakeholders approach to designing those experiences. And so we've done that with this particular project as well. So the Ripple project is really aimed at cross-sector conversations and partnerships around personal pathways and portfolios to ensure that we're not working in those silos. We're wanting to address the need for new knowledge, skills, and delivery methods across those different sectors as we help our students to develop their competencies in whatever programs they choose. Obviously, for me, the liberal arts is really at the heart of my interest because that's my background, but we are engaging our colleagues in education, business, science, etc. So some of the areas of focus are really thinking about how we might connect K-16 personal pathways and portfolios. We have an interesting opportunity in British Columbia, the province where my university is in Canada, in that the K-12 curriculum has been totally redesigned to focus on, to take a more personalized learning approach, and they've very intentionally integrated ePortfolios. So it's a really good moment for us to be speaking to them about how we can really leverage the work that they're doing in K-12 into higher ed, but then also really wanting to engage our workplace and community partners in these conversations as well. We're interested in thinking about 21st century employability skills and emerging capability for innovative workplaces. So how might we embed innovation readiness into the K-12 and higher ed sectors so that our students are really well prepared for their workforce participation? So we want to design that way, but we also want to backwards design from employers themselves and community partners so that we understand what their needs are and make sure that we can embed that into the earlier education experiences of our students. And we really want to think about what are those emerging workplace and knowledge practices. If we think about things like knowledge-intensive work, collaborative knowledge building, where might there be opportunities for us to develop projects that really address those needs across the various sectors. So Tom talks about how we are really fostering a new kind of learner in this work, at least this is what we're hoping to do. And, thinking about moving from sort of what we've talked about as T-shaped learning, where you get depth or in a particular discipline and then breadth through developing soft skills or professional skills in other places, to a more K-shaped focus, where we are developing and focusing on students' capability for applying really diverse ways of knowing within specific emerging knowledge practices. So, for instance, what would that look like for my history students? How would I need to allow them to develop those skills and embed those skills in the curriculum, but also be working with workplace and community partners so that they can really work toward being employable in lots of different areas? And that's something that, I know for sure from lots of my graduates. They don't go into history necessarily, but they have had lots of interesting careers. But how can we really ensure that we're designing learning experiences to help them get there, which might include new minors or certifications in knowledge-intensive work or in knowledge practices based on what employers are telling us. So I think it opens up a lot of space to do new things and for new learning designs that are focused on those kinds of practices, as opposed to really thinking about you must learn to write a paper and you must learn to give a presentation and you must learn to do research, all good things, but what do they mean in the broader context of the world and work in which the students will be living as they move into the future? And this is really drawing on the work of Peter Goodyear and his colleagues on epistemic fluency and helping our learners to really think through how they can transfer their thinking, their ways of knowing in and among contexts. And of course, we want to engage our community and workplace partners in that kind of thinking as well. So obviously, some of the outcomes we're hoping to achieve with this project are more effective formats for learners to develop these knowledge competencies and mindsets, and new ways to move beyond this idea of traditional soft skills to really prepare learners for emerging workplace and organizational needs, which we've been talking a lot about over the last couple of days with respect to badges and things. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavor of the kind of work that we're doing. It is beginning work, but rooted in a long time of portfolio work that I think is quite exciting for us. And certainly when I think about the learners, that's why we do what we do, and so really making sure that they're at the heart of all of this thinking is essential. And so I hope that you will join us in that thinking as well. Thanks.
Other questions? Oops.
Tracy, thanks for that presentation, all your enthusiasm. You've also been involved in this, like you said, for a number of years, and I think it is going to be a challenge moving from that T to the K. And I'm sure you've seen this with portfolios. It's very easy to do it at a course base, but moving to a program or an institution, and I know, listen, each one of us have our culture, but just any best practices, any examples you've seen, or some suggestion, guiding principles about making it more like creating these pathways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we've seen over time, I've worked with lots of campuses in North America and elsewhere, that if it's not really tightly integrated into a program, it's really challenging. And so really thinking through where are there opportunities to engage in this kind of folio thinking within a particular program, and getting the stakeholders on side is really crucial. So we've worked with a number of different programs where we've integrated it, not necessarily in every single course in a program, but there's always a place where it's introduced, reinforced, and then where students can get to that proficiency level. So at least it runs across the program over time, because we know that those abilities to reflect effectively on learning do take time to develop. And so really thinking about in a programmatic or institutional way is important. And I would just add that really understanding the learning organization in which you're working with portfolios is essential. So often I see implementations that really are divorced, it seems, from the institutional mission and strategy. When I am asked to go to a campus, it's the first thing I look at, and I shouldn't be surprised anymore, but almost always the people who are doing the ePortfolio work have not paid attention to that at all. So if it doesn't fit with the, flavor of the institution, it's just not going to fly, and we're not going to get that kind of broader buy-in that we need from our senior leaders to make it successful. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Jim Broom for Reclaim Hosting. I will be intrigued by the work done by Jim Broom, the idea of really reclaiming our identity, and so to be able to be in full control of your own data, your own image, and I think that interesting idea to be helpful for ePortfolio and also with open data.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. On the program, you might notice it says Jim Groom, Reclaim Hosting, Italy. As you can probably tell from my thick Italian accent, this is my first time speaking in English, so I'm a little bit nervous. In fact, I'm not from Italy. My wife's from Italy. She's from Trento. Why do I say Trento? Because the Italians are awesome. They're constantly teaching me, because when I say Trento in my American accent, they laugh. And then they say, oh, Trento, you mean? So anyway, it's good to be here. This is my first time presenting, I think, officially. No, it's my second time presenting in Italy. But it is my first time presenting in a room this elaborate, right? I feel like, if I mention Helen or Troy, something's going to happen, right? Like, don't you think like there's a keyword when you say it, this stuff all comes alive? I don't know. It's trippy. I love it. But that's been like me in Italy for the last year, because I've been here for a year and I'll probably be here for another year. I feel like a tourist. I'm constantly walking around in Trento, and I'm looking at the mountains and these sidewalks that are 1,000 years old. And this has nothing to do with my talk, but now I'm going to get to my talk. Okay, my title is Our Portfolio Could Be Your Life. And the title is inspired by a lyric from a song by a band from San Pedro, California, from the 80s called the Minutemen. They were a punk rock band, very influential in certain spheres. Some people may have never heard of the Minutemen, but they actually had an ethos. And their ethos was, we jam econo. We jam on the cheap. We're not a big band. We're not trying to be a corporate band. We're not trying to be successful. We're dealing with ideas, and we're dealing with a certain amount of kind of intensity of thought and power and emotion and passion. This kind of ethos is what has inspired a lot of the work that we've done. And that title has been the subject of a book by Michael Azerrad, which if you're into punk rock, I highly recommend. It's called Our Band Could Be Your Life. And this idea of our band could be your life was the ethos of punk rock, right? Like, you didn't need to be a great musician. You didn't need to be a superstar to sit down and start creating something meaningful. I think that's a very powerful kind of vision. So I was preparing for this talk, and yesterday at the conference, I saw this by the VP of Marketing for the Linux Foundation. You know, the Linux Foundation, basically, they run the internet, saying open source, the punk rock of the 21st century. And I was like, you know what, that's pretty cool when you think about it, right? These open formats, these open standards, these open technologies that are fueling and undergirding the work we all do. It's a powerful idea. And I like that the metaphor of punk rock kind of is carrying through to the technological sphere. But my presentation is going to take a left turn now, so I'm just warning you. Does anyone here, and feel free, this is where it gets interactive, and this is kind of an American term, so forgive me. My Italian brethren will understand maybe. Anyone ever hear of the term called noodling? Not to be confused with spooning? Yes. What is it? You can yell. Yell. It is. And it's not only catching catfish, but it's catching catfish with your hand. So these cats go down into holes in a swamp, and they stick their hand in. It could be a beaver, it could be, a snake, it could be who knows what, and they catch catfish. And if you go on YouTube, I warned you, if you go on YouTube, get ready, but if you go on YouTube, you can see some of these catfish are like 60, 80, 100, 200 pounds. And it's actually legal only in 12 states in America. Because it's dangerous as hell. You could drown, you could get attacked by a beaver. Beaver are particularly dangerous. And it's actually a thing. People catfish, right? Now, this, you're like, what the hell, right? But I got you. You're stuck, right? You see that? Now, does anyone know what catfishing is? Does anyone know? Anyone? Yes, Don. Absolutely. It's a big problem. And again, on Twitter, I saw something that happened yesterday, and I'll talk about that for a second. Does anyone, I know you do, Phil, but does anyone else know who this person is? Here. I know one person does. Alan Levine. Yeah, Alan Levine, he's a blogger, writes about digital storytelling, and you'll notice, I know that, Phil knows that, like there's a triangulation of people who can confirm this identity. This is Alan Levine. Yet, this is a Facebook account for, can someone help me with the first name? My Italian is not that good. I'm kidding, it's not Italian. How would I pronounce that? Anyone? Okay, Carapai Jose Chaco. That's not Carapai Jose Chaco. That's Alan Levine, but this individual, this catfisher, has stolen these images and has actually taken on the identity, at least the physical semblance of identity, of Alan Levine, who's a prominent blogger, at least in educational technology. But the plot thickens. How many of you have heard of Alec Couros, another very prominent blogger, ed tech professor from Canada? He's actually at the University of Regina. And yesterday, Facebook canceled his account. They terminated his account. This guy has 2,300 friends on Facebook. He's been on Facebook for 10 years, right? He has like 100,000 Twitter followers. He's kind of like famous on the internet, right? Facebook, because someone who started an account with Alec's likeness and name said that this guy's a fraud. So, what did Facebook do? Based on their amazing algorithms, they said, hi, Alec. Looks like your account's a fraud. We're going to have to suspend it. Big fan. Sorry about those 2,300 people that you interact with on a regular basis. And I was back and forth with Alec on this because I found it fascinating. And he said, I'd love to know the algorithm where a 24-hour no-follower Facebook account successfully reports